That morning began as any other, yet beneath the quiet calm of my small kitchen, an unease had already settled like an unwelcome guest. I sat at the worn oak table, the surface scarred by years of use and memories, its familiar presence a fragile comfort. My fingers trembled slightly as they gripped my phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media. Faces and places blurred into a careless parade of laughter and sunlit joy, until I caught sight of them. My son, Jake, and his wife, Melissa, basking under a golden sun on a white sandy beach, their smiles wide and carefree. It was a vivid splash of color against the grayscale of my morning, and it cut deeper than I expected. I studied the images carefully. Jake's arm draped possessively over Melissa's shoulder, their designer sunglasses reflecting endless waves and a sky so blue it almost mocked the dull gray of my own morning light. Champagne flutes sparkled in the sun, tiny bubbles racing upwards like the careless promises they seemed to share between those two. Their happiness, or at least the version curated for their social audience, was on full display, unabashed and oblivious to the quiet shadow I had become in their lives. A cold wave rolled through my chest. I leaned back in my chair, bitterness creeping up my throat, bitter and sour like spoiled fruit that had gone unnoticed far too long. That vacation was a symbol, loud and glaring, a reminder of their disregard, their choice to exclude me, to show the world the life I helped build, the life I once nurtured, without sparing a thought to the woman who was supposed to be at the heart of it. I wasn't surprised exactly. The years had been marked with subtle slights and careless dismissals, all wrapped in the smile of family gatherings where my presence felt more like a duty than a desire. But seeing those pictures, that smug testament to their enjoyment without me, ignited something dark and resolute deep in my core. It was anger, yes, but far more than that. There was hurt tangled with pride, disappointment threaded with a steely determination I hadn't felt in a long time. My gaze fell to the small silver ring on my finger, a simple band Jake had given me the day of Melissa's wedding, now dull and worn. How many sacrifices had that day hidden behind its sparkle? The long hours of juggling jobs, the quiet nights spent worrying, the countless moments during which I swallowed my own pain to lift theirs. This ring had witnessed my silent struggles, my quiet endurance, and in return, I had been handed silence, invisibility, the kind of neglect that wasn't loud but hurt all the same. Yet there I was, watching them live the life I had dreamed of for my family, and they had stepped over me to make it theirs. The realization settled like a stone in my stomach. They were thriving in the paradise I had unknowingly built for them, and I was left outside its gates. Slowly, the initial sting of betrayal began to crystallize into something else. Not desperation or pleading, but a cold, measured resolve. The woman who had given them everything would not be cast aside so easily. This was no longer about sorrow or longing. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, about taking back the narrative that had been rewritten without my consent. I pushed the phone aside, the screen still glowing with their laughter. The house around me was silent, save for the faint hum of the morning breeze brushing through the curtains. I closed my eyes, letting the memories wash over me. The birthday parties I'd planned, the exams I'd helped Jake study for, the dress alterations for Melissa's wedding. Every act of love now weighed against the heavy injustice of their disregard. A slow, steady fire began to kindle within. Patience had always been my ally. I was no stranger to endurance, no novice in the art of watching and waiting. Yet this time, patience would serve a different purpose. This time, it would be the precursor to action. This time, The quiet woman in the background would step out from the shadows, her strength born not of loud confrontation, but of a silent, unshakable power. I rose from the table, the creak of the old chair echoing in the stillness. The sunlight slipped through the window, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. As I moved through the familiar rooms of my house, the weight of years seemed to lighten, replaced by a burgeoning clarity. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I chose to turn the page, and as I locked the front door behind me, the keys cool and firm in my hand, I felt, for the first time in years, that I held the power. The best revenge, I told myself, was watching them indulge in their paradise while I quietly possessed its keys. The days stretched forward in quiet succession, each one marked by a deepening resolve that settled into my bones like a slowly hardening stone. The rush of anger that had surged through me the first morning after seeing Jake and Melissa's vacation photos softened into a measured calm. I found myself sinking into a silence thick with contemplation, a silence that both comforted and unsettled me. Alone in the stillness of my home, I let the memories rise and fall, carrying with them the weight of a lifetime spent giving love, time, and sacrifice that had been met with neglect and disregard. I remembered the many nights spent by Jake's bedside when illness gripped him, my hands soothing a fever that felt like it might break my body as well as his. Those endless afternoons filled with homework and tutoring, where I patiently explained things a dozen times over without complaint, determined to build a foundation for his future. And then the whirlwind of Melissa's wedding, a cascade of flowers, dresses, and elaborate details that I arranged with care, though my heart ached quietly beneath the surface. Every stitch pulled, every rose petal placed, was a testament to a love that was no longer reflected in their eyes. Even now, when I reached out with the hope of inclusion, my messages were met with polite excuses or no response at all. The invitations I sent to family dinners, the small gestures to bridge widening chasms, were brushed aside by a pair too wrapped up in their own lives to notice. The gatherings were hollow without me, yet I was treated as though I was a mere shadow, a fading relic of a family I once belonged to. But in that solitude, a strange clarity emerged. The truth, raw and undeniable, made its presence known. I was no longer invisible, not truly, and I was no longer willing to accept that place on the sidelines. I would carve myself a space again, but not as I had before. No longer the woman who quietly bore her hurt and begged for recognition, but as a force to be reckoned with, calm in demeanor but fierce in purpose. Each afternoon, I settled by the window in my armchair, the frayed fabric worn from years of use, as the sunlight shifted across the room. There, in the shifting patterns of light and shadow, I began to nurture a plan. Patience had been my closest companion all these years. Now, it transformed from endurance into strategy. I understood that hasty actions would only reveal desperation, and desperation could be exploited. Instead, I chose to wait, to watch quietly from the wings as the pieces fell into place. The sacrifices I had made over the years were not empty after all. Beneath the surface of invisible pain, I had laid a foundation that no one had expected. Through prudent savings and careful investments, I had quietly amassed resources that had gone overlooked by those who thought me too meek to possess anything of value. While Jake and Melissa chased after status and fleeting pleasures, I cultivated something far more enduring: control. The details they casually dropped during phone calls or family conversations became clues I pieced together with growing precision. They spoke excitedly of the resort where they planned their luxury getaway, a place I had unknowingly invested in over the years through a series of investments I had kept secret. This secret ownership was a thread I intended to pull. Where they saw only a vacation spot, I saw a key to reclamation. I spread out my papers on the kitchen table: bank statements, investment portfolios, property listings. Each document was a silent testament to years of prudent choices. I studied them carefully, uncovering opportunities and plotting the path to assert control. It was a meticulous process, one that demanded my full attention. Mistakes could be fatal. The idea of involving an old friend, Gary, took shape in my mind. He was a seasoned hotel manager, savvy, discreet, loyal. Someone who could help me manage the resort without stirring suspicion in the family. I pictured him nodding calmly as I laid out the plan, his steady presence lending weight to the quiet storm I was gathering. Throughout this time, my inner turmoil took on a quieter form. The sting of rejection and betrayal still lingered, but was now tempered by focus. I allowed myself moments of vulnerability, a single tear traced down my cheek in the moonlight, speaking both of grief and of hope. But these moments were brief, overshadowed by a rising clarity. The woman who had spent years fading into the background was awakening with purpose and power. I practiced restraint, knowing that control was the true strength. I refined my plan in solitude, mapping every step with precision. How to quietly make the necessary purchases, how to secure ownership without alerting Jake and Melissa, how to prepare for their arrival at the place they believed was theirs. The legal jargon, the contracts, the financial transactions once intimidating to me, all became tools in my hands, wielded with growing confidence. Each evening, the house seemed to hum with this new energy, no longer a place of absence and hurt, but a sanctuary of anticipation. I felt the burden of years lifting from my shoulders, replaced by a quiet but powerful resolve. My story was far from over, and I was ready to turn the page. As the days slipped by, I knew the moment to act would come soon. Until then, I would hold this silence like a shield, gathering strength in the shadows. The woman they had dismissed was preparing to rewrite the narrative, not with anger shouted from rooftops, but with patience, subtlety, and a calm determination that could unseat even the most entitled. The best revenge, I reminded myself, was not loud or destructive. It was the quiet satisfaction of holding the keys to their paradise, watching, waiting, and ready. The moment had not yet come, but the stage was set with every calculated move I made behind the scenes. My days unfolded in careful secrecy, threading together a web of strategy that would make the impossible seem effortless. I was no longer just Eleanor Banks, the overlooked mother left behind by family discord. I was transforming into the quiet force that wielded control with subtlety and precision. The weeks before their planned vacation were a whirlwind of clandestine activity disguised beneath the calm rhythms of my everyday life. Mornings were spent reviewing financial statements and real estate paperwork, each detail scrutinized with the sharp eye I had honed over decades. Investments that had once seemed mundane now twinkled with potential, the sum of small, shrewd decisions over the years culminating into something far greater than even I had anticipated. The resort had become not just a place of escape for my son and daughter-in-law, but the centerpiece of my carefully crafted plan. Through a series of discreet transactions, I maneuvered to acquire a controlling stake in its ownership. The process was labyrinthine, filled with legalese, intermediaries, and a labyrinth of trusts and holding companies I had studied meticulously to exploit. Every step was a dance of silence, ensuring that no whisper of my intentions reached their ears. Late into the night, under soft lamplight, I would call Gary. His voice was steady and reassuring, a reminder of the network of trust I could rely on. Gary's connections within the hospitality industry were invaluable. I wove him into the plan with care, explaining in low tones the role he would play overseeing operations and discretion alike. He understood that this was more than business. It was justice veiled in quiet assertion. As the closing date for the acquisition approached, I felt the building tension between anticipation and nerves. A decade ago, I would have shied away from such a bold move. Now, there was no hesitation, only calm determination. I pictured Jake and Melissa, so confident in their entitlement, entirely oblivious to the fact that their coveted paradise was slipping through their fingers, held gently but firmly in my grasp. The details commanded my full attention. I ensured every legal document was airtight, double-checked by trusted advisors and myself. I scrutinized guest records, service schedules, and financial forecasts. My preparations extended beyond mere ownership. I was planning an experience that would subtly unsettle, an invisible hand behind every carefully curated moment they spent on the grounds. Through it all, I remained outwardly composed. At family gatherings, I smiled politely, my eyes watching but not betraying the storm gathering beneath my calm exterior. Jake's arrogant smirks and Melissa's biting remarks bounced harmlessly off the walls I had built within myself. They continued their lives of luxury and indulgence, unaware that the very ground beneath them was no longer theirs to command. I had become a master of concealment. The past years of quiet endurance were now my greatest strength. I turned my frustration into focus, transforming invisible wounds into strategic victories. This was not about a confrontation born from rage, but the patient execution of a plan that was as much about reclaiming dignity as it was about justice. The day the papers signed and the ownership transferred was a quiet victory. No grand announcements or public battles, just the silent passing of control into my hands. I held the documents firmly, feeling their weight as if they were the keys to a kingdom I'd been denied for far too long. The power was no longer theoretical. It was real and within my reach. I began coordinating with Gary, who slipped effortlessly into his role, managing the resort's day-to-day operations with his usual professionalism and discretion. Together, we plotted every detail of the upcoming visit. From the greeting at the entrance to the arrangement of their suites, nothing was left to chance. I wanted them to experience luxury and comfort, yet with each precise gesture to feel the invisible presence of control that awaited them. Names for suites held symbolic weight now. The regret suite reserved for their apartment, a subtle nod to the memories of neglect and dismissiveness they had shown me. The menu was crafted with care, thoughtful nods to moments of family tension translated into elegant dishes that spoke the quiet language of irony and remembrance. Despite the hard work and secrecy, I found moments of quiet excitement. Watching my plan unfold in the privacy of my thoughts was a balm to the wounds of years spent feeling powerless and unseen. The knowledge that soon they would be enveloped in a reality I commanded gave an unexpected sense of peace. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in, brief shadows in the edge of my vision. What if my efforts went unnoticed? What if Jake and Melissa laughed off the subtle signs, oblivious as ever? But I pushed those thoughts away. The strength built over decades had taught me resilience. Their entitlement was a brittle shell, and pressure applied in the right places would crack it open slowly but surely. In the quiet hours of dawn, I traced the invisible threads of my plan again and again. The legal aspects were locked down, the management settled. Now all that remained was the final flourish, their arrival, and the unveiling of the world they believed was theirs. I envisioned each moment, their expressions caught between indulgence and growing unease, the slow dawning of the truth settling on their faces. The days leading up to their trip were punctuated by a strange combination of nervous anticipation and steady purposefulness. I took solace in the simple routines around my house, yet every glance at my phone made my heart beat a little faster. When the call came to confirm their itinerary details, I listened carefully, noting each arrival time and special request with meticulous care. This was my moment to turn patience into action where silent power would manifest not in loud declarations but in the quiet assertion of control. The debts of years past would be repaid. The narrative would shift irrevocably in my favor. I was no longer the bystander reading their story from a distance. I was the author, and soon they would realize it. As I stood before the mirror on the eve of their arrival, my reflection was of a woman transformed. Not only had I reclaimed an asset, but I had reclaimed myself. The faded lines on my face carried the weight of experience and triumph. A calm smile touched my lips, steady and resolute. Tomorrow, the quiet battle would begin not with swords or shouts, but with gentle, unyielding control. I would watch as they indulged in the paradise I now governed, each of their movements traced by my unseen hand. Their denial of my place in their lives was about to meet a reckoning crafted in silence and subtlety. The best revenge had never been loud or vengeful. It was patient, strategic, and unshakably quiet. Holding the keys to their paradise, I was poised to watch the facade crumble, knowing I had already won. The morning unfolded with an unexpected serenity, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Light spilled generously through wide windows, casting warm hues over the elegant lobby of the resort now mine, in more ways than they could guess. I stood in the quiet distance behind a discreet set of glass doors, the polished floors stretching before me like a stage where the final act would soon begin. The sleek black car glided smoothly into the circular driveway, its engine barely disturbing the peaceful morning air. I watched as Jake and Melissa emerged, their faces radiant with the sort of careless happiness earned only through indulgence and privilege. In that instant, my heart tightened for all its wounds. That glimpse of my son was not lost on me, but it was Melissa's sharp smile, confident and unyielding, that truly embodied the world I had been shut out from. They moved toward the entrance, oblivious to the fact that this was no longer a playground carved out for their whims alone. This was a carefully crafted territory, one governed by the patient hand that had been invisible for too long. Every detail they experienced in the coming days would be shaped by me, each gesture whispering of a power they had foolishly underestimated. The reception was a dance of polished professionalism. Gary had ensured his team was briefed with a blend of warmth and just enough formality to unsettle without raising alarms. The staff smiled broadly yet kept their eyes attentive to the unseen threads pulling this visit's strings. I observed as Jake reached for the registration papers, his fingers brushing the sleek ink that declared me the true owner of this sanctuary. His brow furrowed subtly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, quickly masked by arrogance. Melissa glanced at me briefly, her eyes a silent mix of surprise and irritation, the first cracks in their carefully maintained facade. Their suite was waiting, bathed in late afternoon sunlight, luxurious yet suffused with a quiet symbolism. The Regret Suite, the name elegantly displayed on the polished plaque by the door. A subtle touch, perhaps unnoticed by many, but heavy with meaning to those who knew the story it told. Inside, the space was nothing short of exquisite soft linens, bespoke furnishings, curated artworks, each piece selected not only for comfort but to provoke a contemplation of the past and the silence that had defined us. I had instructed the staff to sprinkle small touches that spoke more than overt confrontation ever could. A photograph of the original family home sat prominently on the mantel, framed in a delicate silver frame, an unspoken reminder of roots severed by neglect. The menu featured dishes that once graced our family table, reimagined with sophistication but steeped in nostalgia. Dinner was arranged in a private dining room perched on a balcony overlooking the restless ocean below. The rhythmic crashing of the waves was a soothing yet relentless backdrop, echoing the steady unraveling of years of quiet betrayal. As I entered the room, the air shifted. Jake and Melissa's startled gazes revealed their unpreparedness for this reclamation. There was no dramatic entrance, no raised voice, only a calm, measured presence that filled the space completely. I spoke plainly, recounting the truth of the resort's ownership and the years it had taken to bring this day to fruition. There was no appealing to their empathy, no pleading for recognition. Instead, I offered facts, the kind that cut deeper than any harsh word. Each revelation dismantled the scaffolding of entitlement they had built, leaving them exposed to the weight of their neglect. Jake's face tightened with disbelief. His usual bravado wavered, his mouth opening to protest before closing again, words lost beneath the gravity of undeniable truth. Melissa's eyes flashed with anger but also a dawning realization that this was no accident, no oversight. The subtle power I wielded had been carefully cultivated in the shadows, and now it was undeniable. Their shock was palpable, woven through the strained silence that settled at the table. It was a reckoning long overdue. I recounted the stories of being overlooked, dismissed, the countless invitations unanswered and calls ignored. I described not with anger but with clarity how they had treated me, the mother who stood behind the curtain, silently watching as her family's affection was parceled away in bits to others. The evening progressed with a fragile tension hanging between us. They moved through their courses with hesitation. The opulent dishes contrasted sharply against the growing realization that indulgence no longer guaranteed control. I watched their glances dart across the room, noting the slow emergence of unease as the reality sank in. After the meal, I left them to their suites, withdrawing to my own villa nestled quietly among the verdant gardens of the resort. In the solitude of my space, a peaceful yet potent satisfaction settled over me. The heavy burden of years past felt lighter, replaced by the quiet pride of a plan executed with precision and grace. I allowed myself a moment to breathe deeply, closing my eyes and absorbing the weight of my triumphant silence. There would be no shouting or scenes. This was not about spectacle. It was about quiet dominance, invisible yet absolute. The resort was no longer theirs by inheritance or assumption. It was a realm I governed with steady hands, and their grand illusions would crumble beneath the gentle pressure of my quiet command. Lying in bed that night, the distant murmur of the ocean was a balm. The knowledge that I had reclaimed not only property but dignity gave me a sense of peace I had not felt in years. Their entitlement was a fragile construct, and I had become the steady force dismantling it from within. In the days to come, I would continue to oversee every detail of their experience not as a vindictive overlord, but as a quiet architect of justice. There would be moments to come when they might sense the strings pulling behind their indulgence, moments of discomfort born from the subtle reshaping of their paradise. But that was a part of the plan. The realization that the paradise they so arrogantly took for granted was, in truth, under my control, would grow with each passing hour until it was undeniable. For now, the night embraced me with silence, and I rested in the knowledge that this first step was a victory, not loud, not dramatic, but powerful and uncheckable. The true battle had begun, in shadows and whispers, not in shouts and storms. And in this quiet power, I found my strength renewed. The evening air was heavy with an atmosphere I controlled entirely, a delicate tension stretching thin on the edges but unbroken at its core. Sitting across from Jake and Melissa, I felt a calm strength settle over me, the weight of years of silent endurance giving way to a quiet authority that neither of them had anticipated. Their eyes, sharp and wary, reflected shock, confusion, and finally, the beginnings of a realization that the power dynamic they had long taken for granted had shifted irrevocably. There was no anger in my voice, none of the drama they expected, just the unwavering delivery of truth. I spoke matter-of-factly, recounting the years of neglect and dismissal, the moments I'd been sidelined, invitations ignored, the calls unanswered. I told them of the sacrifices they chose to overlook, framing the story not as a lament, but as an unvarnished account of the invisible labor and love I had poured into their lives. This was a recounting of fact, delivered with detached clarity, and it unsettled them far more than a heated argument ever could. Jake's expression hardened. He clenched his jaw, the mask of confidence slipping for a moment, betraying the internal conflict roiling beneath. Melissa's eyes, sharp and assessing, flickered with something almost like regret before she masked it with a cool exterior. Their silence filled the space, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement, each pause a subtle crack in the facade they'd built around entitlement. I let the moments stretch, letting the truth sink in slowly, like salt leaching into a wound. They were forced to confront what they had ignored for so long, that the paradise they luxuriated in was neither theirs by birthright nor sacrifice, but upheld by the very woman they sought to diminish. I reminded them without rancor that control over this resort, over this family's legacy, was now firmly in my hands, a silent but powerful truth. As I spoke, I watched the subtle shifts. Jake's refusal to meet my gaze spoke to a mix of anger and vulnerability he wasn't ready to admit. Melissa's composed demeanor faltered in micro-expressions, a tightened jaw, a hesitation in her speech revealing cracks in her confidence. They were grappling with the new reality that their world was built on assumptions easily dismantled by patient resolve. This moment belonged to me not because I sought to humiliate, but because I claimed what had been rightfully mine all along. The quiet triumph was in their inability to deny the facts, in the unraveling of their entitlement under the weight of my steady gaze. We moved through the courses of our meal with a tension that transformed the opulent setting into something surreal. Each bite was heavy with meaning, every glance a silent negotiation of shifting power. I noticed the small, almost involuntary gestures, Jake's tapping fingers, Melissa's tightened lips, the way their voices attempted to maintain control but faltered beneath the truth I laid bare. I remained composed throughout, a steady presence amid the storm that brewed quietly between us. Their discomfort was my victory, unspoken yet undeniable. The illusions of privilege were stripped away, revealing a vulnerability that they had spent years shielding from sight. When the meal concluded, I rose with poise, collecting my things without haste or emotion. Their stunned silence as I left the room was more telling than any retort. It was a surrender not loud or public, but profound in its quietness. I walked away knowing the real battle had only just begun. This was the first act in a series of reckonings that would unravel the threads of neglect and entitlement. Back in the sanctuary of my villa, surrounded by the familiar sighs of the ocean breeze and the soft rustle of leaves, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The heavy weight of the past months seemed to lift, replaced by a resolve tempered with peace. I was no longer the sideline mother, but a woman who had reclaimed her narrative with grace and unwavering strength. I thought about what lay ahead. The days would bring challenges, subtle tests of their response, moments where the undercurrents of control I wielded would ripple gently but undeniably through their experience. I did not seek to crush them, only to assert a dignity long denied, to let the truth settle in their bones. Their denial of my place in their lives had been a quiet wound, but tonight, in the honest shadows of that room, it began to heal through acknowledgement, even if grudging. The path forward was not about rekindling warmth through confrontation, but about establishing respect through presence and quiet authority. As I lay in bed, the distant call of the sea offered a soothing cadence, a reminder that nature's rhythms endure beyond human conflict and folly. I felt an unexpected calm, the knowledge that this moment fraught with tension yet suffused with justice was the turning point I had long awaited. The satisfaction of my silent victory was profound. There would be no need for spectacle or retribution. This was a reckoning woven in threads of patience, observation, and subtlety. I held the keys not just to a property, but to the reshaping of a family dynamic long dominated by neglect and entitlement. Tonight, I had shown them that the quiet woman they dismissed carried the power to change everything without raising her voice. It was a strength measured not in volume, but in unwavering presence. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time in years, I felt the steady certainty that I held the pen and this story would end on my terms. They left the next morning, Jake and Melissa retreating into the life they had always known, one of extravagance and careless entitlement. Their departure was quiet and unhurried, but beneath the surface lingered the weight of the night before, hanging over them like a shadow they could neither escape nor deny. I stood silently on the porch of my villa, watching their sleek car wind along the wooded drive and disappear into the distant road. A sense of closure settled over me, mingling with relief and an unexpected surge of hope. The resort no longer felt like a battleground for silent grudges and unseen betrayals. Instead, it breathed with a new kind of freedom, the freedom of a sanctuary rightfully reclaimed. Each flower in the garden, every stone lining the pathways, reminded me that this place was no longer tethered to the pain of neglect but blossomed into a symbol of resilience and renewal. The oak tree under which I sat bore quiet witness to the years of endurance that had brought me here. The solidity of its branches reflected the strength I now felt within, steady and unshakable. In the solitude of that moment, memories returned not as wounds but as lessons etched deeply into my soul. The nights spent awake nursing their childhood illnesses, the sacrifices masked as everyday tasks, the countless invitations unanswered or politely declined. Each memory was a thread woven into the tapestry of who I was, not a victim, but a survivor who had quietly weathered every storm. This place, this reclaimed paradise, was proof of what I had endured and what I had become. The keys I held were more than physical objects. They were tokens of dignity and authority I had earned through unwavering patience and quiet resolve. No longer sidelined or dismissed, I was a woman who had rewritten her own story. I let the future stretch out before me like a vast, open sea, limitless and inviting. The silence that once echoed with loneliness had transformed into a language of empowerment and grace. It whispered promises of new beginnings shaped by my own terms, untouched by old grievances. As twilight deepened and the ocean's steady rhythm filled the air, I embraced a profound truth. Revenge was never about raised voices or dramatic scenes. True triumph resides in reclaiming one's life, in finding peace and purpose beyond the shadows cast by others' neglect. My victory was in that serenity, that quiet command of my own destiny. Their absence, once a source of aching pain, had become a wellspring of liberation. The breeze carried me forward, gentle and persistent, like the resolve I had nurtured deep within. In their retreat, I discovered my own arrival into a life redefined by strength and calm dignity. This was the victory I had sought, not loud, not public, but deeply and entirely mine. Watching them unknowingly lavish themselves upon what I now held, I found a profound sense of justice and empowerment beyond bitterness or revenge. Now, as the night wraps its velvet cloak around the resort and the stars awaken in the vast sky, I am truly home not just in place, but in spirit and purpose. The story that once belonged to others now rests entirely in my hands, and I welcome the chapters that have yet to be written. For the first time in many years, I am free, and that freedom feels like the most powerful triumph of all.